In celebration of our convocation, we were pleased to invite and delighted that she accepted our invitation to invite to our pulpit the General Secretary of the United Methodist Church's Board of Church and Society, the Reverend Dr. Susan Henry-Crowe. I have known Dr. Susan Henry-Crowe for a good many years. I think neither of us cares to confess how many. Amen. I knew her principally in her position as the Dean of Chapel of Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia, where we frequently had time to interface as we saw to the education, fulfillment, and formation of young people who were seeking to serve God, not just in the ordained ministry, but to serve God in Christian vocation in many ways throughout the world, for which she did an exemplary job and had a passion for it. I would also mention that she served for a season on the United Methodist Church's High Court. She was a member of our Judicial Council. But more recently, she has accepted a call from the church to take the position of the General Secretary of our Board of Church and Society. That entity brings her passion to help all United Methodists live out their faith in the world in a deep and transformative way. And so it is that I would ask you to join me as we welcome today Reverend Dr. Susan Henry-Crowe. Welcome her with me. Amen. You're welcome.
Good morning. I'm so happy to be with you. I have not had a congregation for 7 months now, so thank you for being my surrogate congregation. I have known your pastors a while, some a little bit longer than some others. You are so fortunate to have this pastoral team. There is no church in United Methodism that I think has a better team, and they are doing a wonderful job, and I really appreciate the invitation and your great hospitality in having me here. Hear now these words from the Gospel of Matthew. For fear of him, the guards shook and became like dead men. But the angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid. I know that you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here, for he has been raised, as he said. Come and see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell his disciples he has been raised from the dead. And indeed, he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him. This is my message for you." So they left the tomb quickly with fear and great joy and ran to tell his disciples. Suddenly Jesus met them and said, "Greetings." And they came to him and took hold of his feet and worshipped him. And then Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee. There they will see me." May God bless the reading and the hearing of these words. I know that part, I just didn't get it right. One time, I was really afraid. Someone that I knew had been hurt, and I was really afraid that he might die. I was so tempted to stay in my house and to pray and to pace back and forth and to be on the telephone with those that were closest to me. And one of my friends said to me, "You have to let that go. And I suggest that you go over to Eggleston Children's Hospital and you go up into the neonatal care and you tell them that you have come to rock some babies." 4 times in the passage that I have just read, we hear the word fear. Fear plays into our deepest anxieties. After a horrible time at the end of World War I, reparations that were harsh gave rise to anxiety and fear, which gave rise to nationalism, which then led to xenophobia and anti-Semitism and racism. And after 9/11, that gave rise to anxiety because we here in the United States were afraid and we felt so vulnerable. And because we were frightened and anxious, we did what seems to be normal. We labeled and stereotyped those we did not know and understand. And in those days, I was at Emory, and many a young 18 and 19-year-old Muslim student sat in my office in tears because they had been held for hours at an airport en route home for Thanksgiving. One did not even get to go home, and I had her over that year for Thanksgiving. When we are afraid and we have a loss of our identity and that something is happening to us or to our world, like when I was so afraid that that person I loved might die, I was so tempted to be isolated and to protect myself. And so we do that. And the fear of loss of our personal security plays into our anxiety and our fear. And then we want to clarify who we are and who we are not, and what is our identity and who we're not. And I had the privilege not long ago of visiting one of the great conferences of this church, the Oklahoma Indian Missionary Conference. It is very expansive, and there are 28 native languages spoken in Oklahoma. And as I traveled about, I continued to hear the importance of maintaining tribal identity through language. And we all try to maintain our identities, of which we have many, through our own many languages. The language of what we wear, how we speak, you have a hint of where I am from, whose friendship we cultivate, and the boundaries we do and do not cross. Now, living on Capitol Hill is not so comforting in this matter. Born out of the great principles of justice and democracy, Washington is so grand and so beautiful. Like many places in the United States these days, though, just under the surface, there is a lot of ambition, and there is a lot of fear, and there is, oh, so much anxiety. It is driven by power and money, which is driven by fear. It is quite like the morning of today's gospel reading. There are so many standing around, scared to death. Scared to death, scared and immobilized and stunned and weeping and screaming and pacing back and forth in the house, in the apartment, afraid to go and to rock babies in the hospital. That is not the life to which you and I are called. Our own Methodist heritage helps us move from fear to prayerful and thoughtful spaces where we address the ills of society. Methodism's historic care for transforming the world by addressing society's ills is at the very heart of who we are. you remember that piety and social holiness are the principal characteristics of our DNA. The church helps all of us understand the work of church and society and the work of congregations like yourselves and the work of global ministries in offering its best thinking on social issues. And we have it written down in our social principles and in our book of resolutions, which is about that thick. And sometimes it's helpful and sometimes it's not. And yet we struggle to discover how to promote healthy family life, adapting in healthy ways to living in economies that are changing and will continue to change. And what does it mean when you're a 55-year-old white man and you don't have a job? And what does it mean when you're that group back there, when they graduate from college, they might not have jobs? And they'll come home and be restless, and so will you. And what does it mean to advance health systems for all? And what does it mean to promote public education that we were so well known for from the very beginning of time? A short story in 1748, that was a really long time ago, when the Wesleys established Kingswood College, they established that college, which in those days meant what we know as a high school, for young men and young women who were not the sons and daughters of patricians, for ordinary people, ordinary young people, to have an education. It is at the heart of our identity of engaging in education for the transformation of the world. The church and church and society tries to help us do that. Since the time of Wesley, the Methodist movement has been committed to working against violence in every form. Slavery, street and gun violence, which is out of control in the city of Chicago. Unjust labor practices that still hire children. Violence against women, and I will not talk about what we have heard all week on the news. The temperance movement, which helped build the building at 100 Maryland Avenue, was a progressive call to root out violence caused by alcohol and addiction, prostitution, and prize fighting. Your Board of Church and Society is charged with addressing the root causes of a broken world and advocating for just resolutions shaped by the gospel and by the United Methodist Church. We engage in ministries of mercy for the wounded and broken, and systems and justice for systems that can destroy life. Mass incarceration is wrong. It breaks families apart and it destroys communities. Trafficking is wrong. The average age of boys trafficked in this country is between 8 and 9. The average age of girls is 13 to 15. And there are 300,000 reported cases of children who are trafficked. It abuses children for the gain of others. Church and society is charged with helping articulate biblically grounded and theologically faithful ways to address these issues. I was very aware recently when my wonderful staff and colleagues, we were talking about some of these issues one day in a staff meeting, and we were listing what everybody was doing. And I could feel the pain in the room, not because of the import of the issues with which they were dealing, but with the human stories of the brokenhearted and the wounded. The issues are painful, and the work is joyful. Today, new discoveries and the world needs the best of Methodism's wisdom. Genetics, technology, population growth, migration, the changing nation state all require our best thinking and understanding and discernment. New understandings of the brain help us to know more about mental illness. We have a long way to go in destigmatizing mental illness. I don't need to tell you because I know that there have to be those in your families who live with the burden of mental illness. Articulating more clearly our long-held theology on restorative justice is at the heart of ministry. Fostering an understanding of God's economy is critical. And the world, the whole wide world, needs us. And they need us when we're at our very best. In this world where obsession and consumerism and suspicion and anxiety and mistrust and fear reign, we have to hear the words of Jesus. Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid to engage with the poor and the immigrant and the migrant because you yourselves were migrants. Women who are caught in the web of violence, young black men caught in systems of poverty and violence. And poverty is not the cause, you know that. It's what causes poverty that's the problem. Those who are tortured, those who are sick, those in prison, women and children at the borders all around the world, those who are excluded, those on the margins, those who are shut out. We are called to let go of our fear, both personal and corporate, and live boldly and courageously and gracefully into life that is and the world that is becoming. The Christian message is the way of life, the way of hope, and the way that saves us. Do not be afraid. You do not have to be afraid of those who are unknown to you, because who is standing right beside you? Jesus Christ. You do not have to be afraid of angels unawares. There was one this morning that most of you did not see. She was a little princess in boots. You do not have to be afraid of one another. You do not have to be afraid of the risen, living one, Jesus the Christ. His Holiness, the Pope, wrote, "The church which goes forth is a church whose doors are open. Going out to others in order to reach the fringes of humanity does not mean rushing aimlessly into the world. It is better to simply slow down and to put aside our eagerness in order to listen to others." And then he says, "Let us go forth to offer everyone the life of Jesus Christ. I prefer a church which is bruised, hurting, and dirty, because it has been out on the streets, rather than a church which is unhealthy from being confined and from clinging to its own security. I do not want a church concerned with being at the center, which then ends by being caught up in a web of obsessions and procedures. More than the fear of going astray, my hope is that we will be moved by the fear of remaining shut up within structures which give us a false sense of security, within rules which make us harsh judges, within habits which make us feel safe, while at our door people are starving. And Jesus does not tire of saying to us, 'Give them something to eat.'" The angel continues to the women, "I know you're looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here. He has been raised. He is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him. Encouraging them through their fear, he says one more thing. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee. There they will see me. Where is Galilee? We remember, but it's sort of faint in our memory. It is where much of the ministry of Jesus is centered. It is the heart of the fishing industry. It is where healing takes place. It is where Jesus comes to them. What Jesus means is that they will see him there in the encounters with the poor, when they visit those in prison, when they heal the sick and help women and children and men out of the web of violence and bind up the wounds of the brokenhearted and care for creation. Caring for the poor and those on the edges of life and seeing those on the margins of life beyond our imagining. In Liberia, when no one can get in. And assuring that there are places for women and children. That is what Jesus means when he says, go on to Galilee. A couple of things about myself. I am a child of the church, and that used to be my row right back there. We sat there every Sunday, and I will tell you all later what we did. It was not paying attention to the preacher. I had a wonderful Sunday school teacher. His name was Mr. Buchanan. I was in the 10th and the 11th grade, and he had us read real theological statements. We didn't read the Cliff Notes version of theology. We read what Bonhoeffer said and how he died in prison. We read what other theologians said and where it led. I participated in the United Nations seminar in New York in 1967. It was the days actually of the 6-Day War, which some of you will remember and many of you will not. And we had studied about the Middle East for one whole year. Our director of Christian education said, if you're going to New York to study the Middle East, we will study it. So we ate food of the Middle East, and we listened to music of the Middle East, and we learned the Bible stories as written from the Middle East, and so forth and so on. And I remember standing on the 13th floor overlooking the National Security Council as King Hussein of Jordan got out of his car and walked into the Security Council. At the time, I could not articulate this, as was said this morning, but that was the day that I became a citizen of the world. I knew that my church, as wonderful as it was, would never be able to fully contain my curiosity and my wonder and my excitement about being a Christian in the world. The summer of 1969, I worked in a migrant ministry program on Johns Island, and that is a wonderful and lovely story which I will not tell you today. But in the midst of that program, another 18-year-old and I helped give birth to a baby in a little tiny hut on Johns Island because the hospital in Charleston did not take those people. It changed my life, and it was another time that I was called to ministry. The church then, I think, was more open on the issues of sexuality than perhaps it is now. And the issues of race in the South and perhaps in the rest of the country were not as hidden as they sometimes are now. And real engagement with the world is what the church gave me. Now, building vital congregations and communities of faith means creating diverse and loving and engaged and witnessing and reaching out communities for their own spiritual health as well as for the spiritual health of those on the margins, for those who are young in this community and out there, for those who have no home in Annandale, for those living with addiction, for those with no voice, for all of us are those who live in the heart of God. As a United Methodist that is mostly in love with the church, mostly, and committed to embracing a world community who lives the gospel for the transformation of the world, it is important to listen and to hear and to tell and to educate and to advocate for and to bring together the communities of God's healing so that justice may come. These are the realities of life that Jesus cares about. That is what Jesus said when he said, "Go on to Galilee." Remember, it is not fear that inspires us, that breathes life into us, that gives hope to our communities. It is the risen Christ. Hear those words. Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. Go on to Galilee. Galilee is where ministry happens, where there are those in prison and families that are broken, and sojourners are not so welcome, and the blind do not see, and the lame cannot walk, and those living with mental illness have no way out. Jesus said, "Go on to Galilee, and there you will see me." Go on to Galilee, and Jesus will find you there. Thanks be to God.